Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to be going through some question predictions for this year's Paper 2 and Paper 3 Edexcel A-Level Politics exams. And for Paper 3, that's both US and global. But before I start, I wanted to let you know about some really useful revision webinars I'm going to be running in May half term that are going to look at both Paper 2 and Paper 3. So for Paper 2, we're going to have a look at UK government, and we're also going to have a look at nationalism, feminism, and anarchism. Of course, those non-core ones will be separate ones as you'll all only study one of them. And then after that, later in May half term, we're also going to be running webinars on US politics and global politics. We had really, really good feedback for the Paper 1 webinars on both UK politics and core ideologies, and you can still purchase the recordings of those now on the Politics Explained website if you're interested. And yeah, these are going to be exactly the same. Hundreds of slides, loads and loads of detail, the key information you need to know, the key questions that could get asked, some key essay plans for the most important questions to really prepare you really well for those Paper 2 and Paper 3 exams. So yeah, go to the Politics Explained website if you want to sign up for those, where you can also find loads of other resources to help you in your politics A-level, including detailed essay plans covering every part of the course, updated textbooks that do the same, and a place to sign up for those webinars or for tutoring if you're interested. But without further ado, let's get into it. So I'm going to start this one in exactly the same way as I started the predictions video for Paper 1 with a really important disclaimer. And that's that you shouldn't only revise these topics. You should make sure that you revise everything on the specification, because anything could come up, including topics that were asked about last year. So these predictions are effectively educated guesses on what's more or less likely to come up based on what's come up previously in recent years. As a result, you're definitely not going to be well prepared for the exam if you only revise these topics. You need to know for Paper 2 and Paper 3, you need to know every part of the specification really well to be fully prepared for the exam, and you certainly shouldn't just revise these topics. That being said, let's have a look first at UK government predictions for this year's exams. A few topics then are slightly less likely to come up this year due to coming up last year. So that's not saying that they can't come up this year. They absolutely still can, and Edexcel have formed for asking questions on topics 2 years in a row, for example referendums in the UK politics section of Paper 1 in the last couple of years. But I think these are less likely to come up, and that's House of Lords reform, sovereignty, and the relationship between the executive and parliament. I think the relationship between the executive and parliament could definitely still come up. It's probably the most likely of these three to come up, but House of Lords reform and sovereignty are relatively small topics that came up last year, so they're a bit less likely to come up this year. Of course, still very much could. Everything else then is as likely as anything else to come up, and as I said, you need to revise everything. But there's some topics, either with a hunch, are more likely than others to come up based on what's not come up in recent years. The first of those is Supreme Court. It's a really big topic that hasn't been asked about in a couple of years, so you should know that really, really well. Both questions about the level of power of the Supreme Court and its interaction with Parliament and the executive, and potentially questions about the extent to which it upholds judicial independence and neutrality. Similarly, another big topic that hasn't come up in a couple of years is devolution. A really big, important topic that you should know well, and that's both about point 4 as well, debates about further reform. So it's about the success of devolution and how effective devolution's been in the process of devolution, but also how that links into the debates about further reform, particularly in relation to English devolution, but also maybe about giving more power to the existing devolved bodies as well. Ministerial responsibility hasn't come up in a couple of years. I think that could definitely come up. It's a really topical question and a really interesting one to consider with Starmer coming back in, making some changes to the ministerial code, and of course seeming to listen to and respect ministerial responsibility more than Johnson's government especially did. Number 5 then, the functions of Parliament, including the legislative process. So that did come up a couple of years ago, but it was more about comparing the House of Lords and the House of Commons in relation to their functions. So something more about looking at the extent to which Parliament performs its legislative role effectively, or its representative role effectively, or more generally just performs its functions effectively when you might bring in legislation, passing legislation, scrutiny of the government, and representation. That could absolutely come up. There's a really good essay plan for that on the Politics Explained website if you're interested. The ways in which Parliament interacts with the executive, so this has come up recently, it's a big topic, and things that haven't come up specifically in a long time are backbenchers and Prime Minister's questions. So There are a couple of smaller topics that are really interesting and haven't come up specifically just a question on those. So it could be a broader question on the way Parliament interacts with the executive, where you want to bring in select committees, PMQs, backbenchers, the opposition, lots of different things. Or it could be a more narrow one on PMQs or backbenchers potentially, and that could be a source question as well. Similarly, there's a few smaller sections of Prime Minister and the Cabinet topic that have never come up. For example, presidential government, the extent to which the Prime Minister is presidential, the factors that govern the Prime Minister's selection of ministers. So, what's the most important reason in how the Prime Minister selects ministers? Is it, for example, loyalty? Is it competence? It was about comparing those factors and also the factors that affect the relationship between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. So you could get a question like, evaluate the view that the size of the government's majority is the most important factor influencing the balance of power between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, for example. And then finally, the European Union. So this would be a difficult question. And of course, the spec has changed a lot since when it was first written because Brexit happened effectively and the UK formally left the European Union. This topic still hasn't been asked, I think, since 2019. So absolutely still could be. So you need to be prepared for that question. And the key focus potentially of that question would be on the extent to which it's impacted the constitution and the extent to which it's impacted parliamentary sovereignty in particular. Moving on then to paper 3, and first, before we look at global, we're going to have a look at US politics and government. Again, these predictions are based on which topics haven't been asked about in recent years, and it certainly doesn't mean that these topics will be asked about, or that other topics won't be asked about. You need to revise everything and know the whole specification really, really well. We're going to first have a look at 30 markers. So big topics most likely to come up in the 30 markers are the presidency. So it wasn't asked about last year or the year before in the 30 markers. Again, it doesn't mean it has to come up this year, but it makes it a bit more likely. And the constitution as well. So potentially federalism as a question could be, or the amendment process. Those kind of topics, the US Constitution and federalism, wasn't asked about last year. So I think it's a bit more likely to come up this year as well. And there's some smaller US topics likely to come up at some point in the next couple of years because they've never been asked about. And that could be party policy, looking at the Democrats and the Republicans. It could be comparing them or looking at one of them specifically. The amendment process, which has never been asked about, but is a really interesting, deep topic where you've probably studied in a lot of detail. And some really interesting questions that could get asked about that. Race and rights hasn't been asked about since 2021, so you could get a question, for example, on whether affirmative action is the most effective method for protecting or promoting racial equality in the United States, or whether measures to promote racial equality have been effective or not. Federalism as part of the Constitution hasn't been asked since 2021. I think that absolutely could get asked about this year. Congressional oversight and presidential elections and their significance are also two smaller topics that haven't come up in a while, and therefore maybe a bit more likely than some other topics. But as I said, any topic could come up, any question could get asked. You need to know the specification really well. Even though it's a massive specification for the US, it does make it very difficult. In terms of 12 markers then, big US topics I think most likely to come up in the 12 markers, they didn't come up last year, are the presidency again, so it wasn't asked across the whole of the paper last year, and Congress, which wasn't asked about in the 12 markers last year. And again, some 12 marker topics that have never been asked about: the House of Commons versus the House of Representatives, party systems, Supreme Courts, which hasn't been asked about since 2021, especially the extent of their powers, nature and sources of the constitutions, comparing those, whether similarities or differences, and the extent of the accountability of the Prime Minister versus the President to their legislatures. And again, I've made mock papers. You'll see they can get them for free on the Politics Explained website. We've got lots of, I'll put them in the first link in the description, 2 mock papers for every paper to help you prepare, and I've based those around these most likely questions to come up. So if you want to help prepare for that exam, writing essays is one of the most useful ways you want to prepare, and the most effective way. You need to be doing essays in timed conditions, practice ones, and mocks in timed conditions, and they're the perfect mocks to practice with, and they're completely free on the website, so go and have a look at those. The final paper 3 topic we're going to have a look at then is global politics. Once again, revise everything. These predictions are based on which topics kind of have come up or haven't come up in recent years, and it certainly doesn't mean these topics will be asked about or that other topics won't be asked about. You need to revise everything. You need to know the specification really, really well. In terms of 30 markers, then some big global topics that are most likely to come up. Of course, any topic could come up, but these are a bit more likely based on not coming up recently. That's political and economic global governance. So that's topic 2, and regionalism and the EU, topic 5. The first of those is a really important topic and wasn't asked about last year or the year before, and regionalism in the EU wasn't asked about last year. So some smaller global topics that are likely to come up at some point in the next couple of years because they've never been asked about or they haven't been asked about in a while. So make sure you know these really, really well. And that's NATO. It's never been specifically mentioned in the question. The United Nations have never been a question focused just on the UN. And of course, you could have one combining those two as well, looking at the effectiveness of political global governance. Non-state actors' effectiveness in tackling contemporary global issues. I'm sure that's one that you'd find quite difficult. It's a really difficult topic, but it is at the bottom of political and economic global governance, and also human rights and environmental global governance. So it could absolutely be asked about. I think it's maybe a bit more likely in the 12 markers, but you do need to know it well for a potential 30 marker question as well. And in that, you could potentially look at either break it down based on different non-state actors, so look at NGOs, multinational corporations and social movements, for example, or you could break it down by the area where they have impact. You could look at the economy, the environment, or poverty, the environment, and human rights, for example. Of course, that's very dependent on the question as well and what it's asking you. Topic 4, the status of China and the status of the US, such an important topical question in relation to global politics, such an interesting one. We've never had a specific question just on, for example, whether China is now a superpower or whether the US is no longer hegemonic. This could also be phrased as a question about whether the world order, the changing nature of the world order, so is it unipolar, is it bipolar, is it multipolar, or the extent to which the world order has changed since 2000. These all ask very similar questions. Of course, you need to adapt your answer to them. But the general status of China, the US, where is the world order, could definitely be asked about and hasn't come up in a while. The spread and development of liberal ideas has never been asked about, so that's the kind of the status of democracy, the rule of law, and liberal kind of economics in the world, and the extent to which it's kind of been in decline or is still dominant. Obviously, some really interesting developments since the second Trump presidency in relation to that. State power classifications has never been asked about in a 30 marker, so that's about kind of democratic states, semi-democratic states, failed state, rogue states, autocratic states, and their impact on the global order. So you could get something on, for example, evaluate the view that autocratic states aren't the biggest threat to stability in the global order. Something like that, of course. So lots of different question phrasings you get asked about in relation to that as well. Regional organisations other than the EU have never been asked about except in relation to sovereignty. So you could get a question on the extent to which they're successful. The extent to which regional organisations other than the EU are likely to pursue further supranationalism. And of course, there you're looking at the African Union, ASEAN, and the Arab League. And also potentially it could be asked about whether they're successful. Have regional organisations been successful? So a lot of these questions have never been asked. In terms of the 12 markers, then big global topics most likely to come up in the examined 12 markers. Regionalism in the EU, which hasn't come up in these since 2020, exactly the same with the state and globalisation. I think they're pretty likely to come up. Of course, anything could come up as I keep going on about. Power and development wasn't asked about in this examined 12 markers last year, so it could absolutely come up as well. And some smaller examined 12 markers have never been asked about, and therefore will come up at some point, I think, in the next 4 or 5 years. So make sure you know these really well, but of course you need to know everything well as well. Polarity and the world order, for example. So examine the differences, for example, between a unipolar and a multipolar world order. The spread of liberal ideas. Examine the similarities in the development of the rule of law and democracy in the world. For example, hard and soft power, it was asked in a 30 marker last year, but has never been asked in a 12 marker. So examine the difference in the effectiveness of hard and soft power. For example, humanitarian interventions, you get a 12 marker on that, comparing it potentially with human rights courts. Examine the differences or similarities in their effectiveness, maybe. Theories on development, dependency theory versus classical economic development theory, for example. Really look at there, comparing the differences between those. It's very likely you get similarities. There aren't many, but different. You could get asked about the differences between their analysis of global politics, for example. And again, looking at non-state actors and global civil society has also never come up in the 12 marker, so it could definitely come up as well. In terms of the analysed 12 marker, then I think this is much more difficult to look at what's more or less likely. There's a couple of topics that are maybe slightly more likely than others to come up. That's globalization. So you can look at analyse the views of, or the extent to which realists and or the differing views of realists and liberals on globalization. Also, the likelihood of conflict, for example, an order in the world. So yeah, as I've kind of really emphasized throughout, you need to know everything well, you need to revise everything, you need to know the whole of the specification. These are just some topics that are potentially slightly more likely than others to come up based on not having come up in recent years. As I mentioned halfway through the video, I've made 2 mock papers for every paper for you to kind of for free on the Politics Explained website. Is in the kind of free resources section that you can go and download, and they're really useful resources to help prepare you for the exam, and they're based around topics, some of these topics that I think are relatively likely to come up in this year's exam. So anyway, you need to be doing mock papers, you need to be doing essay questions in time conditions to practice a number of times before this year's exams, and these are the perfect resource to help you do so. So yeah, let me know if you've got any questions in the comment section below. As I said, we're running some revision webinars for paper 2 and paper 3 in May half term, so go to the Politics Explained website if you want to sign up for those. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.